Oregon Territory, winter of 1869. The wind screamed through the bare branches above the trading post yard, shaking loose the last of the ice-crusted pine needles. A thick gray sky pressed down like a warning. Beneath it, men gathered in a ragged half-circle, boots planted in trampled snow, breath steaming from weather-chapped mouths. Some chewed tobacco, others drank from dented flasks. But all of them watched with an uneasy mix of curiosity and cruelty. At the center of the yard stood a crude wooden platform, hastily nailed together for the occasion. And on that platform stood a woman, or what remained of one. She was barefoot in the snow, feet mottled with blue, hands bound tightly in front of her with a frayed rope. Her dress-torn calico faded to the color of dust hung loose over a belly gone hollow from hunger. Her shoulders curled inward, not from weakness, but from memory, as if they were used to dodging hands that meant harm. Over her head was a sack, burlap, stitched hastily, with only a slit for air and two crude holes cut for eyes. No one knew her name. No one asked. "Today's final lot," the trader barked from the steps beside the platform, slapping his gloved hands together like brushing off dirt. He didn't say woman. He didn't say human. Just lot. He was a squat man with red knuckles, tobacco stains on his beard, and a voice like rusted wire. Healthy enough, strong back, young, can cook, clean, and don't talk back. Or talk at all, far as I can tell. The men chuckled. One of them, a tall rail of a man with broken teeth and a gun belt riding low on his hips, called out, "What's under the sack? Lem pretty face or prison scabs?" The crowd laughed. "Lem," the trader sneered. "Ain't for me to say, that's up to the buyer. Sack stays on unless the man who wins her says otherwise. Deal's clean. No returns." He didn't look at her. No one really did. They looked through her like she was meat hanging on a hook, even in the quiet moments between jokes. The kind where breath fogged the air and someone shuffled their feet against the snow. She remained still. Her eyes, hidden behind the crude sack, didn't flinch. She hadn't spoken since arriving in the back of a supply wagon 2 days prior, arms and legs tied, tossed in beside crates of oats and salted pork. She hadn't cried either. "Starting bid's $1, Lem said flatly. Silence. Someone coughed. Another man muttered, "Hell. I paid more for my dog." 50 cents then, Lem barked, irritated. "Come on now, can't get a broom for less than that these days." Still, no hands raised. The wind picked up, cutting sharp between coats and collars. A man near the front spat into the snow and turned away. Another elbowed his friend and whispered something about used goods. More laughter. The woman didn't move, but her breath quickened, just slightly, like the fire inside her was starting to flicker for lack of air. Then a voice from the back, "I'll pay too." The crowd stilled. It wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the cold like a bell in church. Heads turned. The man who'd spoken stepped forward, boots heavy, shoulders broad beneath a worn wool coat. He wore no hat, only graying hair slicked with melting snow. A plain man, quiet-faced, with hands too big for comfort and eyes the color of muddy river water. His name was Elias Corbin, a lumberjack from up north, known more for keeping to himself than trading at auctions. $2, he said again, firm. He looked not at the trader, but at the woman, or rather, the shape of her. Lem's brow arched. "You want the sack too?" Elias didn't answer the joke. He reached into his coat, pulled out a crumpled bill, and stepped forward. No fanfare, no second glance. "She goes free from rope," he said. "And you hand her down gentle." That silenced even the cruel ones. Lem hesitated, caught off guard by the dignity in Elias's tone. But money was money, and he wasn't a man to argue long. "All yours?" he muttered, pocketing the bill. Elias stepped up to the platform, slowly, carefully. His breath was steady. He didn't touch her at first. He just stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth through the cold. Then, as if asking permission in silence, he reached for her wrists, The rope came undone with a few firm tugs. Her hands fell limp in front of her fingers, stiff, red with cold, knuckles scraped raw. She didn't lift them. She didn't retreat. He didn't try to remove the sack. Not then. Instead, Elias took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. Not like a favor, but like a right. She swayed under the sudden weight of wool and warmth, but didn't fall. His arm, wide and solid, settled gently around her back, not pulling, not forcing, just steady. Together. They stepped off the platform and into the snow. No one stopped them. No one dared. The crowd parted. Some scoffed. Some watched with unreadable eye. But none followed. The woman's name was still unknown, her story unwritten. But for the first time in months, maybe years, she walked beside someone who didn't push her, sell her, or look through her, just walked with her. And in the stillness of a frozen Oregon morning, that was enough to begin something new. Still in Oregon territory, winter of 1869. The road back to Elias Corbin's homestead was long, crooked, and mostly hidden beneath a thick blanket of old snow, the kind of snow that silences everything, even your own thoughts. But Elias didn't speak anyway. He simply walked, the woman at his side, still veiled in that rough burlap sack, said nothing either. Her steps were slow but deliberate, bootless feet wrapped in strips of wool Elias had cut from his undershirt. His long wool coat hung over her shoulders, nearly swallowing her frame. Her arms stayed tucked close to her ribs, not in fear, he noticed, but in preservation. They walked like that for nearly 2 miles through pine-covered hills, the sun sinking behind the hills in the west. Every now and then, Elias would glance at her, not to study her, but to make sure she hadn't collapsed. She didn't stumble once. By the time the cabin came into view, a square silhouette buried beneath the weight of snow and solitude. Night had begun its slow descent. Smoke curled faintly from the stone chimney. There was no dog to bark, no welcoming lantern, just the plain smell of wood smoke and silence. He held the door open and motioned her inside. The woman paused. For a moment, Elias wasn't sure if she would cross the threshold. But then she did, slowly, cautiously, stepping into the warmth like someone entering church for the first time in decades. The inside of the cabin was simple, a stone hearth to the left, an iron stove still glowing red, shelves of dried goods lining the wall, a single bed tucked into the corner, and an old table marked with the scars of chopping, scraping, and hard eating. Elias removed his boots, then walked to the stove, opened the lid, and stirred the coals. Without a word, he added a split log, coaxing the fire back to full life. The light painted his face in gold and shadow, softening the weariness in his eyes. He gestured to the bench by the hearth. "You can sit." Still she didn't speak, but she sat. From the corner cupboard, he pulled a tin pot and poured water from the kettle. He added a handful of dried beans and strips of venison, then set the pot over the fire. The smell of smoke and meat filled the air like a balm. When he turned back, she was watching him. Or at least, the eye holes in the sack were tilted in his direction. He could feel it, not like being judged, but simply seen. Elias didn't say much that night. He fetched a wool blanket and placed it beside her, along with a tin bowl of stew and a piece of cornbread. He didn't force it into her hands. He just left it there, an offering, not an order. He sat at the table across the room, ate his own meal slowly, never taking more than his share, never staring, never pushing. She ate too, carefully. Her hands trembled as she held the spoon, but her hunger was honest. When the fire burned low and her bowl was empty, Elias finally spoke again. "I ain't gonna ask you nothing you don't want to tell," he said, voice low, steady. "And I'm not gonna touch you unless you ask me to. This house don't run on rules, just respect." Still, no reply. He leaned forward slightly, fingers curled around his mug. "They said I married you. That's the word they used. But I figure what happened back there was a transaction, paper, noise. Doesn't mean much out here unless we say it does." A pause. "I don't marry faces," he added, I marry people, and only when they want to be married. The fire popped. Then barely a whisper above the crackling wood, a word. Elias, he froze. Her voice was raw, like a throat unused to sound, but it was there. She said his name again, slower this time. Elias. His heart kicked once, hard and unexpected. He sat still, afraid the wrong breath would shatter the moment. I remember you, she said, still muffled through the burlap, but clearer now. 3 winters ago. East of Saddle Ridge, there was a snowstorm. You were bleeding. Elias stared. I helped you. You never saw my face, she said. I wore a sack then, too. He remembered. That frozen night on a hunting trail, his leg torn open by an angry bull elk, barely crawling through the snow, and a pair of hands, gentle but firm, pulling him into shelter, feeding him broth, bandaging his leg. And always, the face hidden behind a sack. You left before I woke, he whispered. She nodded. I thought you'd forget. I never did. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick with recognition, like 2 lost pieces clicking back into place. Elias stood slowly and stepped toward her. Not too close, just near enough that she wouldn't have to raise her voice. What's your name? He asked gently. The woman hesitated. Then, finally, Marabel. He closed his eyes. Something between a sigh and a prayer escaped his chest. Well then, Marabel, he said, I reckon you're not a stranger here. For the first time, her shoulders eased, and though the sack still covered her face, Elias saw something more honest than any uncovered expression trust. That night, he laid out a second wool blanket on the floor beside the fire. You take the bed, he said. Marabel stood quietly, then nodded. Elias didn't watch her undress or sleep. He returned to his place at the fire, sat down, and stared at the glowing coals. He thought about how the world measured a person's worth. By face, by obedience, by silence. But he'd seen more humanity in one veiled woman who refused to beg than in all the men at that auction combined. And somewhere between the hiss of wood and the low rhythm of wind outside, Elias Corbin made a quiet vow not to save Marabel, not to claim her, but to make sure she never again had to be treated like a shadow. He would walk beside her, not because he had paid $2, but because she had spoken his name. Oregon Territory. Late winter of 1869, Elias Corbin had never believed in fate. He trusted in hard work, honest hands, and the quiet certainty of trees that didn't lie. His cabin stood because he'd measured every beam himself. His food stores lasted because he'd salted every cut of meat. Life was predictable, not kind, not cruel, just steady. But as he sat at the edge of his cot that night, staring at the fire and replaying the name she had spoken, Marabel, he found himself questioning everything. He hadn't heard that name in over 3 years. Not since the storm. Not since that night east of Saddle Ridge, when he nearly died. Back then, he'd been tracking a downed tree for lumber when a blizzard came out of nowhere, thick, vicious, blinding. His leg had taken a bad hit when his mule slipped on the ridge trail. He'd crawled through ice and blood and wind, knowing he wouldn't make it till morning, till she found him. He hadn't seen her face, only the sack, the same rough burlap, the same quiet presence. She dragged him beneath an overhang, covered him in pine boughs, pressed a warm flask to his lips. In the morning she was gone, no name, no trace. And now here she was, sitting just feet from his fire, wrapped in his coat, her voice still hoarse, but strong enough to say his name. I remember you. He hadn't known how much those words had meant until he heard them out loud. He turned toward her now, still seated by the fire, legs drawn close beneath the wool blanket. Her head remained covered by the sack, but she tilted toward the warmth, and her hands, now cleaned and bandaged, rested in her lap without fear. Marabel, Elias said again, as if testing the name on his tongue. She nodded. Were you out there that night? He asked gently. Near Saddle Ridge. February. Snow hit sudden. I was trapped by the old ravine. Marabel didn't speak for a long time. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. Outside, wind scratched against the shutters like fingers searching for a way in. Then, finally, yes, Elias's heart gave a quiet lurch. "Why'd you leave before I woke?" She shifted, voice almost inaudible through the fabric. "I was afraid you'd see my face and change your mind about thanking me." He didn't respond right away. He let the silence sit between them like a worn quilt, familiar, warm, covering something broken beneath. "I wouldn't have," he said. "I couldn't have." She looked at him, or at least in his direction. He continued, his voice rougher now. "I'd crawled near half a mile with a busted leg. I couldn't see past my own breath. And you, whoever you were, dragged me through snow and lit a fire from wet kindling. You boiled snow in an old tin and set it by my lips. You didn't speak. You didn't show your face, but you saved my life." "I shouldn't have left," she whispered. "You did what you had to," Elias said. "I reckon you've been doing that a long time." Marabel leaned forward, elbows on her knees, head slightly bowed. "I wasn't always this way." Elias stood and walked to the table. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small tin of salve pine resin and bear fat. He knelt beside her, setting it on the floor gently. "For your hands," he said. "They're cracked worse than bark." She didn't reach for it, but she nodded once. Then, in a voice more brittle than broken, she said, "There was a man once. He came through my parents' land, said he wanted to trade for our winter stores. My father was gone. I was 16. I let him in." Elias didn't move, just knelt quietly, listening. He drank, got angry. I tried to run, he followed. Her breath faltered. I fought back, harder than I ever had. I hit him with the edge of the stovepan. He fell, didn't move. I didn't mean to kill him." Elias's brow furrowed, not in judgment, in pain for her. "My uncle found the body, said no one would believe me, that I had to hide or hang. So he gave me a sack and told me to never show my face again." Elias's fist clenched at his sides. "They passed me between homes like firewood," she went on, each man rougher than the last. "I learned silence. I learned not to cry. But that night in the woods, I saw you bleeding, dying, and for some reason I couldn't look away." She finally looked up. "That was the first time I chose to help someone when I didn't have to." Elias felt his throat tighten. He sat back on his heels and studied her, not the sack, not the scars she'd hinted at, but the person beneath. "You still choose," he said softly. "Even now. You chose to say my name. You didn't have to." She nodded once, the gesture slow and deliberate. "And I'm grateful you did," he added. They sat like that for a long time, just two people bound not by past shame but by present choice. The cabin felt warmer somehow, not because of the fire, but because of something spoken and finally shared. Elias rose, walked back to the cot, and reached beneath it. He pulled out an old oilskin roll and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a folded square of red flannel, torn, worn, stained by time. "I don't know if you remember this," he said, bringing it over, "but when I woke that morning you were gone, and this was left where you sat." Marabel's breath caught. She reached out slowly and took the cloth in her trembling hands. "I remember," she whispered. "I used it to bind your leg. You left it," he said. "I kept it." Tears gathered behind the fabric of her mask. Her shoulders shook, barely, like a tree bending in wind, not breaking bending. Elias didn't touch her, didn't reach for her. He simply sat beside her. And after a long time, Marabel said, "I never thought anyone would remember me for saving something. You saved more than me." Elias replied, "You saved yourself, and that's worth remembering." Oregon Territory, days after the auction. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single day when the distance between them collapsed. No warm speech by the fire, no dramatic moment of shared confession. Instead, it unfolded slowly like snow melting from the eaves in late winter. quiet, steady, measured in gestures, not words. Marabel stayed, though she never said so. She never asked if she could remain in Elias Corbin's cabin, and Elias never asked if she intended to. That, perhaps, was part of what made it work. There were no expectations, no terms, only presence. In the mornings, Elias rose before dawn, just as he had for years. He stirred the fire back to life, boiled water for coffee, and made a simple breakfast cornmeal mush, sometimes eggs when the hens laid. He'd set a second bowl on the small table across from his own and place a mug beside it. Then he'd step outside to split wood or check the snare lines. By the time he returned, the bowl would be empty, the spoon rinsed and laid neatly on the washboard. Marabel never left crumbs. She never asked for second, but she always cleaned up what she'd been given. Some days, she swept the floor. Other days, she folded his laundry and left it neatly stacked by the hearth. Once, when a snowstorm pinned them indoors for 3 full days, he came in from hauling logs to find she had patched a tear in his coat without asking, without announcement. The stitching was careful, even. She still wore the sack. Elias never mentioned it, not once. He pretended it wasn't there, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. To him, the sack was not a veil of shame. It was a wall she wasn't ready to lower, and so he honored it. He spoke to her like he would to any neighbor, offering casual remarks throughout the day. Got a fresh haunch hanging outside venison stew tonight. Storms brewing from the north. Might need to reinforce the woodpile. The creek's thawing. We'll be seeing geese soon. Marabel rarely answered, at least not in words. But over time, she began to respond in other ways. She'd nod faintly, or point to something he was about to forget, a glove left on the windowsill, a lantern still burning in the back room. One night, after a particularly cold snap, Elias woke to find a second quilt gently spread across his chest. It smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. He stared at the ceiling for nearly an hour before daring to move. It had been over a decade since anyone had tucked something around him. On the 11th evening, something small changed. He'd left the table as always, her bowl full of stew and a crust of sourdough beside it. But when he returned from stoking the fire outside, she was waiting, not seated at the table, but standing at the counter with her back to him. She was washing the bowls. Her sleeves were rolled up, and her hands moved with steady rhythm through the warm water. Elias didn't speak. He simply leaned against the doorframe and watched. After a while, she spoke without turning. "You don't ask much." "I don't need much," Elias replied. "You don't look at me like the others did." "I don't see you like the others did." She paused in her washing, then slowly resumed. A full minute passed in silence before she asked why Elias didn't answer right away. He considered her question like a carpenter considers a raw plank, measuring it before making a cut. "Because I know what it is," he said finally, "to be stared at like you're a crack in the wall. Something broken, something folks would rather cover up than fix." She didn't respond, but she didn't stop washing either. They fell into a rhythm. Elias would chop wood while she baked cornbread. She'd tend the fire while he sharpened tools. They worked beside each other without tripping over the weight of the past. Sometimes in the evening, Elias would sit by the fire and whittle. Marbel would sit in the rocking chair nearby, knitting something from a basket of yarn he didn't even know he had. She never said what she was making, and he didn't ask. It didn't matter. What mattered was the rhythm, the sound of the knife on wood, the soft clack of knitting needles, the shared silence that wasn't empty but full. One night, after a supper of beans and biscuits, Elias spoke while drying the dishes. "You know, it's all right if you speak more. I don't mind the quiet, but you don't have to stay silent for my sake." Marabel looked up slowly. "I know," she said. "I just forgot what my voice sounds like. Sometimes." He smiled, not wide, not showy, just enough. "You can practice on me," he said. "No rush. I've got time." Later that week, a hawk flew into the window pane and dropped dead outside the cabin wall. Marabel buried it behind the woodshed, digging gently with her bare hands. When Elias asked why, she said, "Because nothing deserves to die alone." He didn't ask her to explain. He just helped her place a small cross made from pine twigs above the mound. They stood there for a long moment, the cold air brushing past them. "You're not alone now, Marabel," he said softly. She didn't answer, but her hand, ungloved and scarred, brushed against his as they turned to go. She didn't pull away. It was still a house of silence, but now it was silence filled with meaning. Not the kind that hides secrets, but the kind that holds them gently, without judgment. He never asked what she dreamed of. She never asked if he had regrets. They simply built something together, one task at a time. A repaired hinge, a pot of soup, a shared chore, a second chair moved closer to the fire, and in those small kindnesses, silent and steady as falling snow, a home was born. Not just a shelter from wind or wolves, but a refuge for two battered hearts that had never known what it was to be seen and left unafraid. Oregon Territory, late winter, a month after the auction. It happened quietly. There was no announcement, no dramatic gesture, no thunderstorm rolling in as if summoned by the past. Just the steady hush of snow falling outside and the warm orange flicker of firelight dancing on the walls of the cabin. Elias Corbin was washing up from supper beans and salt pork again when he noticed the air had shifted, not in temperature, but in weight, as though something long held in had been let go. He turned slowly. Marabel was sitting by the fire in the rocker, wrapped in the quilt she favored, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But this time, the sack was gone. Her face was turned slightly toward the fire, so he saw it in profile: first high cheekbones, thin lips, skin pale from too many months in hiding. And then, slowly, she turned to him. The left side of her face bore a long, twisting scar. It ran from just below her eye to the corner of her mouth, a wound old and healed, but impossible to. The skin was pulled tight where it had closed, reshaping her expression into something a little harder, a little older than her years. Her eyes met his, and she didn't look away. Elias didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't lower his gaze out of politeness or raise it out of pity. He simply stood, dish towel still in hand, and looked at her the same way he always had, with attention, with dignity, with quiet presence. "I thought I should show you," she said finally. Her voice was calm, tired, maybe, but not weak, like someone who'd carried something heavy for a long time and was finally setting it down. "I figured you already knew," Elias replied softly. "Maybe not what it looked like, but that you were hiding a story." She gave a small, ironic smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Everyone's hiding something. Mine just left a mark." He walked slowly over to the hearth, drying his hands on the towel as he did, and eased himself into the wooden chair across from her. "I'm listening," he said. Marabel took a long breath, and then she began. "I was 15 when he came to the farm," she said, eyes distant now, watching the fire more than Elias. "Said he was a trader, wanted salted pork and cornbread. Mama was sick, Papa was out hunting. I let him in." Her hands gripped the edges of the quilt. "He asked for water. I gave it to him. Then he said I owed him more. I said no." Elias felt something cold coil in his chest. "I tried to run, but he grabbed me. I don't remember how I reached for the blade on the table. It was Papa's skinning knife. I didn't mean to go for his face, but I did." He staggered, slipped on the wet floor, hit his head on the stove edge. She paused. He never got up. Elias didn't speak. He simply let the fire crackle and her voice fill the room. "When Papa came home, he saw the blood. I told him what happened. He believed me. But he also knew how men talked in town, how they looked at girls like me. He said if I told the law, they'd turn it around. That I must have wanted it, that I provoked him." Tears didn't fall from her eyes, but her hands trembled under the quilt. He took me to his brother, my uncle. Said he'd keep me safe. Instead, my uncle told me to cover my face. Said no man would marry me now, that I was spoiled. He gave me that sack and told me never to take it off. Elias leaned slightly forward, elbows on his knees, but didn't interrupt. The years after that blur together. Marabel said, my uncle traded me to a trapper, then another. Sometimes I cooked, sometimes I cleaned, sometimes I hid. The sack was the only thing that kept them from seeing me. Or maybe from seeing their own shame. Her voice was brittle now, but her spine straightened with each word. When I escaped 2 winters ago, I followed the river south, sleeping in barns or under pine tree. I kept to trails, avoided men. Then I saw you. You were bleeding in the snow. Elias nodded slowly. I remember. I wanted to walk past you, I should have, but something in me said you wouldn't hurt me. So I stayed, helped, left before you could see. She turned toward him fully now, and for the first time, Elias saw her face in full. The scar didn't scare him. What struck him wasn't the damage, but the resilience. This was a face that had endured storms and betrayal, that had learned not to scream when struck, that had spent years surviving by shrinking. And yet, here she was, unshrinking. I always thought if someone saw me, or really saw me, they'd turn away, she whispered. Elias shook his head. I've seen worse scars, he said gently, but none carried this much truth. Marabel's lips parted, but no words came. So he continued, you didn't do wrong. You defended yourself, and you were right too. She blinked, and the firelight caught a tear before she could wipe it away. I don't want to wear the sack anymore, she said. Then don't, but I don't know who I am without it. Elias leaned forward and said something she would never forget. Maybe now. You get to decide. That night, she folded the sack and placed it on the mantel, not as something to return to, but as something to leave behind. It sat there in plain view, no longer a prison but a marker, a boundary between what was and what would be. And as the fire burned low and the Oregon wind sighed against the walls, Elias Corbin knew this home, once filled with silence and survival, had now become something more. It had become a place of truth, and Marabel, for the first time in a long time, could breathe without hiding. Oregon Territory, early spring, 1870. The next morning, the air smelled different. Outside the cabin, snow still covered the slopes of the hills, but the birds were returning, first in pairs, then in flocks, calling across the bare branches like they'd never left. The icicles that had hung for months from the eaves were now dripping, softening, retreating. Inside, the world had changed, too. The sack Marabel's mask. Her prison sat folded on the mantel like a flag lowered after battle. Her scar was no longer hidden, and neither was the truth. Elias Corbin stood by the hearth, adding fresh wood to the fire. His flannel shirt still damp from the morning's work hauling water from the creek. He moved slowly, with the same unhurried rhythm he'd always kept, but now, something behind his eyes had shifted. When he turned, Marabel was sitting at the table in the morning light, her face fully visible. Her long auburn hair, twisted into a loose braid, was tucked over one shoulder. The scar across her cheek glinted faintly in the sunlight, but it no longer seemed to pull her down. She looked up at him, not bracing herself, not retreating, but meeting his gaze squarely. Elias sat across from her. There was a stillness in the room that wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had been said the night before, and everything that didn't need repeating. Marabel took a slow breath. You haven't said much, she said, her voice clearer now, less guarded. Elias nodded slightly, thoughtful. I find words work best when they're earned. She tilted her head. And have I earned any? He leaned forward, forearms resting gently on the tabletop. Just one, he said. Thanks. Her brow creased. For what? For telling me. He didn't say it with pity. He didn't offer apologies for a world that had failed her. He simply honored the act, the courage of telling, the bravery of being seen. Marabel looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. The scar had kept men away before or drawn the wrong kind of attention. Always either fear or disgust. Never this. Never a man who... She reached slowly for the mug in front of her, wrapping her hands around the warm tin like it was something sacred. "You're not going to ask me anything else?" she asked, eyes still lowered. Elias shook his head. "I know what I need to." "What if I told you I still have dreams about it?" she said quietly. "That sometimes I wake up gasping, fists clenched, afraid I'm back in that room I'd believe you." She glanced up. "And if I told you that even now, after all this, I still carry shame, not because I did wrong, but because I lived through it, I'd understand," he said gently. "Some things don't wash off in one spring rain." A long silence followed. Then Marabel stood. She walked to the hearth, where the sack lay folded. She stared at it for a moment, her expression unreadable. Elias remained seated, not intruding, not guessing what the moment meant. He simply watched her in the way a man watches a fire, not to control it, but to be warmed by its truth. Marabel turned, holding the sack in her hands. "I wore this for 6 years," she said. 6 winters, 6 springs, through heat, snow, hunger, and nights colder than death. She held it up, then let it fall into the flames. The burlap caught quickly, curling and blackening, its edges crumbling into ash before the center even fully caught. The fire didn't roar, it crackled gently, like it understood. Elias rose and walked to her side. He didn't touch her, just stood beside her, his shoulder barely brushing hers. As the last threads vanished into flame, Marabel let out a breath that felt like it had waited a lifetime. "I never thought I'd be able to do that," she whispered. "You did." She nodded. Then, softly, "I don't know what comes next." Elias looked at her, really looked at her. "You don't have to," he said. "Sometimes what comes next is just breakfast and a good chair." Marabel laughed, soft and broken and beautiful. It was the first sound of pure lightness he'd ever heard from her. Over the next few days, the shift between them settled like new soil over roots. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was trust in bloom. The first hints of connection after a long, harsh winter. They still lived simply. He chopped wood. She baked bread. They worked side by side in the early thaw, clearing the path to the barn, pulling brush away from the chicken run. Marabel no longer pulled away when their shoulders touched. Sometimes she would place a hand on his arm to steady herself, or rest her head against the door frame when he told a dry, quiet joke. One evening after supper, she set down her fork and looked across the table. "Why didn't you flinch?" she asked. When I took it off? When you saw me? The scar?" Elias leaned back in his chair. "I've known men with perfect faces and rotten hearts," he said. "And I've known folks with broken bodies who'd give you the shirt off theirs if you asked kindly." He paused. "What's on your face doesn't scare me, Marabel. What's behind your eyes, that's what matters." She swallowed. "And what do you see there, strength?" he said without blinking. "A kind that doesn't come easy." Marabel's throat tightened. "I don't know what to do with someone who sees me and doesn't want to change me." Elias smiled softly. "Maybe you don't need to do anything." They sat together in the candlelight, the fire casting long shadows behind them. And for the first time in years, Marabel felt like a person, not a burden, not a warning, not a ghost wrapped in burlap, just a woman, still healing, still afraid, but seen and not turned away. Oregon Territory, early spring, 1870. The thaw had come early that year. Icicles no longer lined the roof of Elias Corbin's cabin, and the ground, once stiff as iron, now softened with each sunrise. Wild violets pushed their way through old snow, and a stream dry since October babble whispered again behind the trees. Inside the cabin, life had taken on a gentle rhythm. Elias would rise with the sun, split kindling, and prepare breakfast. Marabel, her scar now bare and her confidence growing, had started humming while sweeping, even laughing when the hens escaped their pen and chased one another around the shed. It was healing. But healing has a way of drawing out shadows that fear the light. One morning, as Elias returned from town with a sack of flour over his shoulder, he saw it. A man on horseback, lean, long-legged, with a rifle slung casually across his back and a star pinned crookedly to his chest, waiting at the edge of the property. His coat was dusty, his horse restless, and though he smiled when Elias approached, the kind of smile he wore didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," the man called. "Morning," Elias replied, setting the sack down. "You Elias Corbin, I am." The man dismounted slowly. "Name's Deputy Clay Monahan. Ride for the U.S. Marshal's office out of Salem, tracking a fugitive." Elias's jaw tightened. "Name's Marabel Weston," the deputy continued. "Woman, scar on her cheek. Been wanted for 6 years on suspicion of murder." Elias stared at him. "She killed a trader named Orrin Dales in eastern Oregon," the man said. "Word is she's been hiding under a sack like some cursed ghost, jumping towns and cooking for widowers. Judge Greer wants her brought in alive for a proper trial." "She's not hiding," Elias said firmly. Monahan tilted his head. "Then where is she?" Elias didn't answer. Inside the cabin, Marabel had seen the rider long before Elias returned. She didn't need to hear the words to know what the badge meant. Her body remembered, but she didn't run. Instead, she did something that startled even herself. She climbed the stairs to the loft, reached under the bed, and pulled out the folded burlap sack, the same one she had burned weeks before. Only, this wasn't the same. This one was new. Freshly sewn. Elias had stitched it one night when she couldn't sleep. Just in case, he'd said, "A decoy's sometimes safer than a sword." She had laughed back then. Now, she slipped it over her head, not from shame, but from strategy. That evening, after Monahan had been invited inside, Elias served coffee by the fire. Marabel stood quietly in the corner, veiled again, hands folded, posture small, playing the part one last time. Monahan eyed her. That her Elias didn't reply. "I'll need her to come with me," the deputy said. "She'll be safe. Stand before a judge. Get her side told proper." Elias set his mug down gently. "You offering a fair trial or a fast noose?" The deputy shrugged. "Ain't up to me." Then a voice spoke low. "Sure. Then let me speak for myself." Marabel stepped forward and pulled off the sack. Clay Monahan blinked, his lips parted, not from disgust but surprise. He hadn't expected her to be this calm. This prepared. "I killed Orrin Dales," she said, loud enough to fill the cabin, but not in cold blood. Elias stood beside her, tall and steady. Marabel continued. "He came to our farm when I was 15. My father was gone. He forced his way in. I fought back. He fell and hit his head on the iron stove. I was told no one would believe me, and so I ran." Monahan reached into his coat. "Still have to bring you in." "Ma'am, I know," she said, "but I won't go without proof." She added, "I have a witness." Monahan raised an eyebrow. 3 days later, Elias and Marabel stood in the back of a small log courthouse in La Pine, Oregon. The room smelled of pine dust and damp wool. A dozen townsfolk lined the benches, murmuring. Some stared openly at Marabel's face, while others turned away. At the front, Judge Greer sat behind a makeshift bench, a hard man with cold eyes and a sharp mustache. Monahan stood beside her, his badge polished. But Marabel wasn't alone. Elias stood just behind her, his hand resting on the small of her back, and beside them, an old woman in a weathered shawl took the stand. Her name was Clara Harrow, once a neighbor of Marabel's family, long thought dead. But Elias had found her in a cabin near Crescent Lake, half blind but sharp as flint. "I remember the girl," Clara rasped. "I remember the bruises. I remember the scream that night. I saw her run out the door, blood on her dress, crying like a baby bird." She paused. "I also remember Orrin Dales, drunk and mean, and the last thing that man deserved was a prayer." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Greer narrowed his eyes. You're certain? Clara nodded once. Dead certain. By dusk, it was done. The charges were dropped. Marabel Weston was free. Truly, finally, free. That night, back at the cabin, she stood beside the fire and stared at the sack folded on the table. Not the one Elias had made, but the original. Elias had retrieved it from the courthouse before it was discarded. It got me here, she whispered. It kept me alive. Elias looked up from the fire, then let it rest. She walked outside, into the spring dusk, and set it atop the old fence post. The wind picked it up, lifted it gently, and carried it into the trees. Not a ghost, not a burden, just fabric, nothing more. Justice didn't come with fanfare. It didn't come with medals or parades. It came with truth, with standing tall, with refusing to hide. And as Elias wrapped his arm around her waist and they watched the stars appear above the ridge, Marabel knew the story written on her skin had been rewritten in love, and the past no longer held the pen. Oregon Territory, Midsummer, 1870. The wildflowers came early that year. By the time the sun climbed high over the timberline, yellow blossoms covered the valley floor like patches of sunlight that had forgotten to rise. Bees moved slowly through the lavender, the air rich with the scent of pine, earth, and something sweeter, peace. It was a small clearing just beyond the edge of Elias Corbin's land. The trees opened like tall, reverent witnesses. The river, just a quarter-mile off, whispered gently against the stones, and a pair of mourning doves cooed somewhere overhead. There was no preacher in a collar, no organ, no pews, no procession. But there was love, and there was a promise. Elias stood waiting beneath a simple arch made of driftwood and twine, tied with sprigs of wild yarrow and sagebrush. He wore his cleanest shirt stiff at the collar from soap, and his boots had been scrubbed with lard until they shone faintly in the sunlight. In his hand, he held a small piece of carved pine, a ring he'd whittled from the branch of a tree struck by lightning the year before. It had split clean through the center. Broken, yes, but not ruined. He thought that fitting. Then through the trees came the sound of soft footsteps. Marabel emerged, walking slowly, her hands loosely at her sides. Her dress was simple, ivory cotton stitched with care, the hem brushing the grass. But what caught the light, what stole every breath from the clearing, was the veil. It was made from the burlap sack, the very same that once covered her face in shame. But now, it had been transformed, hand-washed, lined with soft muslin and edged in lace she'd stitched herself. Where the eye-holes had once been, now rested embroidered wildflowers, blue flax and goldenrod. A seam ran diagonally through the cloth, not hidden, but traced with thread like a scar made beautiful. She had chosen to wear it, not to hide, but to remember. When she reached Elias, she paused. He lifted the veil gently, meeting her eyes. "Still want to marry a person, not a face?" she asked, smiling. He took her hand. "I married your soul the moment you spoke my name," he replied. They turned to face Clara Harrow, the same woman who had stood witness at the courthouse weeks ago, now holding a small, leather-bound book and squinting without her spectacles. "I ain't no preacher," Clara said dryly, "but I know a vow when I hear one. And if you two've got one left to make, now's the time." Elias nodded. He took Marabel's hand, rough fingers wrapped around hers. "I ain't a man of many words," he said quietly, "but I know what matters. I promise to stand beside you, to protect what we build, to see you not just the good days but the storms too. And if ever you forget who you are, I'll remind you." Marabel's voice trembled. "I've worn many names," she said. "Some whispered behind my back, some shouted at me by men who never bothered to ask who I was. But with you, I've been nothing but me. I promise to keep walking beside you even when it's hard, even when we're scared. You didn't rescue me, Elias. You gave me the space to rescue myself." Clara nodded, eyes glistening. "Well then," she said, clearing her throat, "by the sun above and the river below, I reckon you two are bound." Elias slid the carved ring onto Marabel's finger. It fit perfectly. They kissed, not as strangers desperate for love, but as survivors building it with their own hands. The celebration that followed was quiet and full of meaning. Just a few neighbors, some stew, warm cornbread, and a bottle of aged cherry wine someone had pulled out of hiding. Laughter mingled with firelight as the sun dipped below the trees. Elias had strung up lanterns between two pines, and Clara even managed a few stumbles of a fiddle tune on an old 3-string she'd salvaged from her attic. Marabel never left Elias's side. They didn't dance, but they sat on a log near the fire, shoulder to shoulder, her veil now folded gently in her lap. "I think I'll keep it," she whispered. "The veil not as armor," she said, "as remembrance. Like an old scar that no longer stings." Elias nodded. "Scars show where we've been, not who we are." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Weeks passed. Summer settled deep into the valley. They planted potatoes, raised chickens, and repaired the barn roof together. Some days, Elias would carve small things in the evening: spoons, picture frames, a hairbrush handle. Always from pine, always smooth. One day, Marabel placed a hand on his and said, "I want to build something too." What a cradle. Elias looked up. She didn't speak the words. Not yet, but her eyes said enough. Hope, the kind that comes after fire, after ash, after healing. So they began. Side by side, they shaped the wood, sanded the curves, and etched a single word on the headboard burned into the grain by Marabel's careful hand. Weston. Her name, still hers. Forever, the veil would one day rest in a wooden box on a shelf above the hearth, folded carefully between pressed wildflowers, and a note in Elias's handwriting that read, "She wore this not to hide, but to survive." Then she wore it again, not to disappear, but to rise. And if ever a daughter or son asked what it meant, Marabel would tell them that some names are stolen, but the truest ones are reclaimed. That love isn't something found, it's something chosen, again and again. And that strength isn't loud. Sometimes it begins with a sack, a scar, and a man who didn't flinch. Oregon Territory, 1 year later. The house stood quietly at the edge of the trees. It wasn't much by the standards of townsfolk down in Lapine, just a 2-room cabin with a stone chimney and a split-rail fence, but to Marabel, it was a cathedral. Every log had been laid with calloused hands. Every stone in the hearth had been lifted by Elias Corbin, his shirt soaked with sweat and resolve, and every board, every hinge, every nail whispered the same thing when the wind passed through. We built this, together, inside. The scent of pine sap and fresh bread mingled with something softer. Lavender hung to dry in bunches from the rafters, sewn into sachets by Marabel's steady hands. Her stitching had become steadier with time. So had her voice. There were still mornings when her fingers trembled for no reason, still nights when her breath caught from a sound outside, or a face half remembered from the shadows of old dreams. But they didn't define her anymore. What once ruled her, what once shaped her world through fear, now lived behind her. Not forgotten, but no longer in charge. On the mantel sat the folded burlap veil. Washed, pressed, preserved, not burned, not buried. It had not returned to hide her, nor to silence her. It remained, instead, as a marker of the woman she'd been, and the woman she'd chosen to become. The seasons had passed with a gentleness Marabel never knew she could trust. Elias never asked her to be someone she wasn't. He never demanded she smile when she didn't feel it, or speak when silence offered more. Instead, he listened, not just with his ears, but with his actions. When her old nightmares returned, he'd light a lantern and sit beside her without a word. When she laughed, truly laughed, head thrown back, eyes lit, he'd watch her like he was memorizing the moment. He made her tea on hard days, heated stones for her back when it ached from tilling, and he never once asked her to forget, because forgetting had never been the goal. Redemption was, on the first anniversary of their wedding, they carved a bench together from a slab of cedar. It sat just behind the cabin, facing west toward the ridgeline, where the sun fell in golden sheets each evening like a blessing across the land. They called it the Silent Bench, not because it demanded quiet, but because it held space for it. Marabel would sit there often, watching the light bend across the pines. Sometimes Elias would join her, sometimes not. She liked that it was a place for both solitude and togetherness, a place to hold things without explaining them. One evening, she brought the old sack with her and laid it across her lap like a shawl. She didn't cry. She simply held it, stroking the edge with her thumb, tracing the stitching Elias had added the night he rebuilt it. "I used to think this was the only thing protecting me," she whispered. Elias, seated beside her, said nothing. Marabel continued, "But it wasn't. What protected me was the choice to survive. This was just a symbol." She looked down at it, her eyes calm. "And now it means something else." "What's that?" Elias asked softly. "That I get to decide," she said, "about who I am, about how I live, about what parts of my story are still mine." Elias reached over and gently took her hand. "You've earned every page." Their life wasn't perfect. No one's ever is. But it was free of pretense, of shame, of the weight of other people's stories. It was honest, built not on fantasy, but on respect and shared labor. And it was theirs. They raised chickens, grew turnips and beans, traded with nearby ranchers for coffee, salt, and tobacco. And they laughed often, especially when Marabel tried to teach Elias to bake and he nearly burned the cabin down. There were still stumbles, but stumbles didn't scare them anymore, because the difference between falling and failing, Marabel had learned, was whether you had a hand to hold when you got back up. One spring, a young woman from the valley came to their door, barefoot and bruised. Her name was Lena, 17, silent as a snow-covered path. Marabel recognized that silence. She gave Lena soup, a place to sleep. She never asked why the girl had run or what she'd seen. Not right away. Instead, she showed her the sack. "This used to belong to me," Marabel said. "I wore it for 6 years. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know there was another way to survive." Lena stared. Marabel continued, "Now I keep it, to remind me that I do have a choice. And so do you." The girl cried, not loudly, just a single sob that cracked the stillness. Then she nodded and stayed. Elias built another chair for the table. Marabel taught Lena how to bake cornbread, how to mend sleeves, how to plant root vegetables deep enough to endure frost. She never called it charity, though she called it legacy, the passing on not of scars, but of strength. Years from now, folks in the valley would speak of the woman up in the pines, the one with the scar and the kind eyes. Some said she'd once been wanted by the law. Others whispered that she had killed a man with her bare hands. Some speculated she was a widow, a runaway, a ghost. But those who met her face to face knew better. They knew Marabel as a woman of quiet courage. A woman who taught that healing wasn't about pretending the past never happened, but choosing not to let it define what came next. They knew her as a wife, a teacher, a mother in time, and a reminder that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who wore the most armor, and learned, at last, to lay it down. And as the years passed and the bench behind the cabin weathered under sun and snow, the initials carved into its frame never faded. Woo, Plazy. See, two souls who met not in perfection, but in truth. Two stories bound by survival and rewritten together in love. Sometimes the most powerful form of healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from facing it, owning it, and choosing who we become because of it. Marabel's journey reminds us that scars, physical or emotional, do not define our worth. They mark what we've endured, not who we are. In a world that often values appearances and silence over truth and strength, Her quiet resilience teaches us something sacred. Dignity doesn't come from how the world sees us, it comes from how we carry ourselves when the world turns away. For older adults, many of whom have lived through their own storms, this story is a gentle reminder that it's never too late to begin again. Love, acceptance, and self-respect are not reserved for the young, they are for anyone brave enough to claim them. We don't heal by hiding. We heal by being seen and by choosing to keep living with purpose, even when the road behind us has been long. Like Marabel, we each have the right to transform what once brought us shame into something sacred and to turn silence into strength.